Congo Square was as much a Latino square as it was an African-American square.
If you go back to the 1500s, you had the Spanish colonies and the French colonies in the U.S. that have their African slaves. And these are slaves that came from Cuba, from Haiti, and brought some of these things to the United States, but they were cut short. You know what I'm saying? Once this becomes the U.S., once those colonies are ended, that attachment is no longer there. We're the ones that retain this, that we're allowed to retain.
Jazz term, the term Latin jazz.
Because if you advertise something that I create with a name, I don't think it's nobody should have the right to come and change the name of that person.
Okay.
What's Latin is? What is Latin? We know Latin to begin with. So that I don't see why they do that. They did it with the salsa. They don't. I hate it. They're gonna do it to my music. My music is Afro-Cuban jazz.
Yeah.
And that's what it is.
Afro-Cuban jazz.
The first stop in our journey to the root of the word Latino takes us to Italy of all places. Or at least you and I would call it Italy today. Back then, from around 500 BCE, it was Latium, and the people from there spoke Latin. With me so far? So let's book a trip to some neighboring territories now. The term Romance languages refers to languages like Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian, and Romanian. And that's because they all hail back to ancient Rome, the heart of Latium. The Roman Empire, through conquest, spread Latin to these lands, where they eventually grew into the languages we recognize today. For our purposes, we're going to focus on the former Roman province of Hispania, or modern-day Spain, where they speak, well, Spanish. It's that one little connection, Latium to Latin to Spanish, that ended up playing a key role in shaping how we understand the word Latino today. See, the definition Latino as a person either living in Latin America or a person of Latin American descent is very recent. Because of Spanish and Portuguese colonization, most people south of the United States border ended up speaking one of those two Romance languages, but classifying them all together under a cohesive identity wasn't a thought that occurred to most people. That is,
no conversation unlocks the complexity of the Hispanic versus Latino conversation more than Brazil. Can you be Latino without being Hispanic? Yes. Can you be Hispanic without being Latino? Yes. Can you be both? Yes. Can you be none? Yes. Who is what and what is life? Let's start with the easy part. Are Brazilians Hispanic? No. Why? Because Hispanic means you come from a Spanish-speaking country. And in Brazil, they do not speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese, and if you insinuate otherwise, they might kill you. They will lose their shit. But are Brazilians Latino? That question can only be described as the relationship status used in high school to make your ex-boyfriend jealous.
Oh, you had Facebook in high school.
How old are you? I always assumed my Brazilian friends considered themselves Latino. Like, I didn't even doubt it for a second. Just like, oh, tu es Latina.
You're gonna get so much internet shit.
But then one day I was talking to my friend Joao and he was like, no dude, we're not Latino. And I was like, the fuck? So I decided to ask the question to my Brazilian friends and to people on Twitter. And I got everything from we are Latino to Brazilians aren't Latino according to their heritage and culture to just a gif of Jesus giving me the finger, which, you know, I'm not Christian, but I can tell you right now that's probably not kosher. You're laughing now. But when you meet heaven, Jesus in heaven. Point is, many Brazilians do not consider themselves Latino. And honestly, for me, that's just like, that's just like wasn't expecting it. I feel like I just found out that one of my favorite cousins like was adopted and like they don't consider themselves like part of the family, which doesn't make any sense because I have more in common with Brazil, I feel, than I do with Chile. I understand Brazilians better when they speak, and Brazilians don't speak Spanish. And neither does Chile. I'm kidding, Chile, you know I love you. You're a great country, but honestly, what the f? So, like a...
Did you know that there are 3 places on the South American continent not considered Latin America? They are Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana. In other words, it is possible to live in South America without being considered Latin American. That's right. Surinamese, Guyanese, and French Guianese people are considered to be South American, but not Hispanic, Latino, or Latin American. Are you as confused as I am? Don't worry, we're going to get to the bottom of this. Vamos a investigar. Remember, Latinoamerica includes 26 countries, which meet 2 criteria. A Romance language is spoken. They were ruled by a country that speaks a Romance language. A Romance language is spoken: Spanish, French, or Portuguese. The people were ruled by a country that speaks a Romance language.
I have heard many Brazilians reject this notion on the basis of their culture being super different than the rest of us. Brazil, we're all so different, we don't have anything really that in common. DR and Uruguay are both considered Latino nations. The only thing they have in common are, like, roads. I'd argue all
complicated than just lumping everyone together. What we now know as Latin America was and still is home to hundreds and hundreds of indigenous cultures who saw themselves as independent from one another. And later, when African populations were introduced, most often without their consent, most of these groups were excluded from the nascent notions of a Latin America. But nonetheless, the concept survived, and today we're left with the word Latino, an imperfect word that encompasses a wide swath of experiences, races, cultures, religions, and languages. If it doesn't sound terribly stable, well, that's because it isn't. And the debate roars on over what term, if any, best encapsulates such a broad collection of disparate groups. It was here that an alternative presented itself: Latino. It became an alluring option for people who weren't too comfortable with the word Hispanic for its intimate connection with colonial Spain. In the year 2000, the census added Latino as an option for the first time, though not without controversy. Indeed, arguments over Hispanic and Latino stretch back quite a ways. For example, in 1918, Aurelio Espinosa, the editor of Hispania, an academic journal that still lives on today, argued that using the term Latin America over Spanish America was ridiculous. As editor of Hispania, I most earnestly beg of all contributors and advertisers to use always the old traditional and correct terms: Spanish America, Spanish American. What objections could anyone have against this procedure? It might pain Espinosa if he were to learn that Spanish America and Spanish American have largely died out and seem outdated to us today. But the same might be true of the words we use in the present. We have words like Chicano that mean people of Mexican descent living in the United States, and Afro-Latino to describe people of African descent living in or with a connection to Latin America. We even have words left over from European colonial caste systems, like mestizo to describe someone of mixed indigenous and European descent. And not to mention all the indigenous cultures that continue to survive and thrive in Latin America today, who might define themselves differently, and indeed in entirely different languages than Europeans or Latin Americans would. So in these cases, they might prefer not to be called Latino. It's no easy task to cover all of these people, and in fact, it might be impossible. And if that's the case, well, what do we?
If they are on the South American continent, why aren't the people from Suriname, Guyana, or French Guiana considered Latin American or Hispanic, like the rest of the people on the continent? It all comes down to language. Let's look at the differences between the 2 terms, Latino and Hispanic. Latino, or Latina, refers to people who are from Latin America and speak either Spanish or Portuguese. The term does not include people from Spain. On the other hand, the term Hispanic includes people from both Latin America and Spain. However, some Latinos do not identify with the term Hispanic because it is associated with the Spanish conquerors who brought illness, violence, and oppression to to their stolen empire in the Americas. Let's recap. Most Latinos are Hispanic. A person from Spain is Hispanic, but is not Latino. An individual from Brazil is Latino, but not Hispanic. People from Mexico are both Hispanic and Latino. A person from Suriname, Guyana, or French Guiana is South American, but not Latin American, Latino, or Hispanic. Adding to the confusion, the U.S. Census Bureau defines Latin American as all people from Central America and South America. We recognize this as an oversimplification. After all, Latin America refers to countries and territories in the Americas and Caribbean, where Spanish or Portuguese are predominantly spoken. Belize is not Latin American, since its official language is English. The same is true for Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana. This leaves the three countries we've just learned about, Suriname, Guyana, and French Guiana, in their very own category.
I'd argue all Latin Americans have gone through the same thing. You grow up in your country and you identify as that country, and then one day someone throws the word Latino at you and you're like, what did you just call me? I get it on such a deep personal level, because Latino is a word used in the US to lump us all into some weird, politically unpredictable, and economically volatile family.
You know, I really just missed when the show was...
Officially, Brazilians are not considered to be Hispanic or Latino because the federal government's definition of the term, last revised in 1997, applies only to those of Spanish culture or origin, such as Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, South or Central American or other origins, regardless of race. In practice, this means that in most cases people who report their Hispanic or Latino ethnicity as Brazilian in Census Bureau surveys are later recategorized or back-coded as not Hispanic or Latino. The same is true for people from other groups as well, such as those with origins in Belize, the Philippines, and Portugal.
September 15th marked the beginning of Latino Heritage Month, and if you're still calling it Hispanic Heritage Month, you're wrong. Here's why. Hispanic Heritage Month is celebrated from September 15th to October 15th. However, there is a growing call to officially recognize it as Latino Heritage Month instead, as the term Hispanic is outdated and less inclusive. The term Hispanic refers to people who speak the Spanish language, while the term Latino describes people from Latin America. By using the term Hispanic, we continue to connect ourselves to our colonizer roots by lumping us together with Spain, even though Spain's European culture is vastly different from our Latin American culture. Additionally, and most importantly, the term Hispanic excludes Black and Indigenous people. For instance, Haitians are Latinos, but do not speak Spanish, so they are not included. Brazil, the largest country in Latin America, speaks Portuguese, not Spanish, and the country of Guatemala is still 50% indigenous, and indigenous people in Latin America speak hundreds of different languages. We can never truly celebrate the richness of Latino culture if we continue to exclude and erase Black and indigenous Latinos from our conversations in exchange for holding on to our colonial roots. Happy Latino Heritage Month.
Caribbean country was the first to gain independence in all of Latin America?
Dominican Republic.
You have a guess?
Haiti?
That is correct.
Technically, that's not Latin America. They don't consider themselves Latin America, but hey, if because of the geography they're considered Latin America, I digress.
Ooh, Sahara is challenging the producers. Let me ask in the back to see.
Taíno history is Haitian history. The story of the Taíno people belongs to Haitians just as much as it does to Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Cubans. The darker pigmentation of our skin does not disqualify us from being able to claim the rich history, culture, and ancestry the Taíno people left behind for us. Yes, we are a proud African Black nation, but we still celebrate our deep Taíno roots every day in Haiti. Every time we're called by name, Haitian, Haitien, we pay tribute to our Taíno roots. When we gained independence in 1804, our forefathers decided to go back to the original Taíno name for our land, Haiti, which means land of high mountains. Instead of choosing an African name, we decided to honor the indigenous people who came before us and who were still with us. Our island was the most populated with Taíno people when the Europeans first came. And although in 1565, the Spanish formally declared that the Taíno people were extinct, it's not true. They survived. In fact, the Taíno people were the first Maroons, the first runaway slaves in our land. And then they were later on joined by Africans, and together, Taínos and Africans, they resisted and they fought slavery. It's no wonder Haiti's first army, the one that fought and beat the French, was called the Indigenous Army. Also, Haiti's first constitutions, like Pétion's 1816 constitution, extended citizenship to indigenous people. Still to this day, there are countless culinary, cultural, religious, artistic, linguistic, Taíno expressions in Haiti. Haitian Carnival, one of our biggest celebrations, incorporates many native traditions and musical instruments. Haitian cities like Léogâne are named after the Taíno. Across the nation, we have monuments of Taíno people like the massive statue of Chief Anacaona, which is in Léogâne, the Haitian city where she was born. We have countless schools named after the Taíno people. We have museums that hold precious Taíno artifacts. Haitian Voodoo has significant Taíno influences with the chants and songs and symbols. Even our mother tongue, Haitian Creole, borrows heavily from Taíno vocabulary. Anana, babako, kalalulam, bikasav, and so many more words are Taíno. And many of our cooking techniques, like how we barbecue our meat and how we cook cassave, they were directly transmitted to us by the Taíno people. And let's not forget, some Haitians still have Taíno blood running through our veins. I can keep going, but I won't. Here's the point. Haitians aren't too black to be Taíno.
Congo Square was as much a Latino square as it was an African American square.
If you go back to the 1500s, you had the Spanish colonies and the French colonies in the U.S. that have their African slaves. And these are slaves that came from Cuba, from Haiti, and brought some of these things to the United States, but they were cut short. You know what I'm saying? Once this becomes the U.S., once those colonies are ended, that attachment is no longer there. We're the ones that retain this, that we're allowed to retain.
When the New Orleans-born historian Gwendolyn Midlo Hall passed at the age of 93 on August 29, 2022, she left behind a legacy of books and databases that restored historical identity and agency to the enslaved people of Louisiana. We salute her memory today by replaying this archival Hip Deep episode that featured her in 2005.
Gwendolyn Hall's research on the African presence in colonial Louisiana makes evident that in French and Spanish Louisiana, an indigenous Afro-Creole culture emerged entirely independently from Caribbean influences. Archival data she uncovered prove that the French colonial rulers drafted their enslaved African workforce almost exclusively straight from the continent of Africa. Birth of a Creole culture, people of African descent in French and Spanish colonial Louisiana, 1699 to 1802. French colonial settlement of Louisiana began in 1699 with the expedition of Iberville and Bienville. Although there is evidence that Iberville had interest in acquiring African slaves for the colony as early as that year, records indicate that he had no success in this until 1709 and then only secure a small number. The 1708 census of Louisiana includes no persons of African descent, and the 1712 census, just 10. The colonists attempted to use Native Americans as enslaved laborers, but these efforts were met with great resistance and proved unproductive. In 1719, the first of many slave ships from Africa arrived in Louisiana. Estimates of the numbers of slaves who arrived in Louisiana throughout the years vary widely, but the more recent scholarship, which takes into account the mortality during the horrific Middle Passage and enumerates the people who actually disembarked and lived on in Louisiana, helps us to envision the rapidly growing African population of colonial Louisiana. The first two slave ships of 1719 together landed approximately 450 enslaved Africans, with ships bringing between 87 and 464 people each. By 1743, approximately 5,951 Africans had arrived in Louisiana. However, the survival rate among the enslaved Africans once in Louisiana was not good in the first years. By 1721, the census recorded only 680 Africans of the estimated 2,000 who had been brought into the colony by that point.
French colonization of Louisiana was extremely thin and not very effective and very insecure. There was a serious attempt to bring French colonists over in the early 1720s. I'd say from about 1717 on, they brought French colonists. A lot of them, though, were forced laborers or army deserters. In other words, it was sort of like Australia. It was kind of a criminal colonization. Not that these people were necessarily criminals, but by French law they were, like salt smugglers. And they brought women who misbehaved sexually. And these people didn't function very well in Louisiana, and the people who needed labor ended up by crying for Africans, and disparaging the French workers, saying that they were just non-functional. So the colonization of Louisiana relied very, very heavily on Africans, including African knowledge of rice cultivation, indigo cultivation, navigation, waterways, shipping, construction, so that the technology came heavily from Africa. And they went out of their way to get slaves who knew how to do this cultivation, because the French surely didn't know, and if they did, they wouldn't do it anyway. The first ship that was sent to collect slaves in Africa, first two ships, the captains were instructed to be sure to buy slaves who knew how to cultivate rice and barrels of rice seeds for cultivation. So there was this very conscious decision to do this. And indigo was not produced here until Africans had arrived. And of course, indigo was widely produced in the regions where most of the slaves were brought from.
Which is to say that the white population of early French Louisiana was heavily salted with crooks and whores who were worthless at farming.
So it was the Africans' agricultural know-how that saved the colony.
And started Louisiana eating its basic food to this day, rice.
So where in Africa did these African Louisianans come from?
The French documentation on the slave trade to Louisiana is very, very unusually complete, so that they give details about where the ship went, which ports, and how many slaves they collected, and how many slaves they landed live in Louisiana. And so we know pretty precisely that 2/3 of the slaves during the French slave trade were brought directly from Senegal. We know that those who were collected near the coast were mainly Wolof, and those who were brought from the interior were mainly Bambara. It's better to say Bamana, but anyway, that's a long story I don't need to explain. But the Bamana were mainly males, and the Wolof were heavily females, so that the basic population which was born in Louisiana probably had more likely to have Wolof mothers and substantial numbers of Bamana fathers.
In Africans in colonial Louisiana, Dr. Hall tells us that there were some 5,951 Africans brought to Louisiana on 23 slave ships during the French slave trade. Of those people, 3,909, just about 2/3, came to Louisiana from the Senegal concession. 1,748 came from Ouida, which became part of the Kingdom of Dahomey, and there was one ship from Cabinda in northern Angola with 294 souls on board.
Now, they didn't have so many Senegambians in Cuba, right?
This is really interesting. The French were importing slaves to Louisiana right exactly at the time when the Segu uprising in West Africa was throwing a lot of Bambara captives on the market. But 2 centuries earlier, just as the first slave shipment was about to be sent to Cuba, Wolofs and Bambaras were specifically excluded by Spain from being brought to its territories.
Because?
Because the first slave uprising in the New World had just happened, in Spanish Santo Domingo in 1522, and many of the rebels were Wolofs. King Carlos of Spain responded with a royal order that prohibited bringing to the Spanish West Indies Wolofs or, quote, any others raised with Moors, although they be of the race of Guinea Negroes, close quote. In other words, no slaves from Islamized areas of Africa were to be brought to the Spanish colonies, so they didn't take large numbers of Senegambians to Cuba. Instead, they brought Congos, whom they bought from the Portuguese.
So does this play out in the music?
I think it does.
Gwendolyn Midlo Hall's research has been of paramount importance in unraveling the historical ethnic background of enslaved Africans in Louisiana. Under French rule, between 1719 and 1731, the initial wave came mainly through ports in westernmost Africa, Ile de Gorée, etc. They were people identified as Wolof, Fulbe, Bambara, Mandigo, but also Mina, Fo, Nago, Yoruba from the Guinea coast, and even Chamba from the hinterland in northeastern Nigeria, besides a few from the Congo, Angola region. Hall estimates that 2/3 of them originated from Senegambia.
Prior to 1719, there was an occasional African slave found in Louisiana, brought in by individual owners. However, key to Law's plan for economic stability was a plantation economy based largely on African slave labor. Law received permission to trade slaves directly from Africa to Louisiana. He instructed his agents to seek out slaves who had prior experience in agriculture, especially rice, for the marshlands of Louisiana. The decision to bring slaves directly from Africa had a major impact on the development of African slavery in Louisiana. Unlike among both the Spanish and British, who relied heavily on different types of slave traders who brought in a mix of slaves from many different parts of Africa, most of the slaves who came to Louisiana came directly from Senegambia. Geographically, the Senegambia region includes the area between the Senegal and Gambia rivers. The Wolof were located at the northwest corner of the Senegal River, which runs from the Atlantic Ocean southeastward. East of the Wolofs were the Fulbe. The Bambara people were sandwiched between the southern end of the Senegal River and the Niger River, which flows almost due south. The Gambia River formed the southern boundary of the Senegambia. The Mandingo were found in the southwest corner as the Gambia flows from the Atlantic Ocean into the interior. The largest number of slaves sent to Louisiana in the 20s were the Bambara, who the French described as, quote, robust, good-natured, and intelligent, end quote. The French considered them good slaves because, quote, the labor attached to servitude does not bother them at all. They love their masters, are obedient, and are never subject to flight, revolt, or despair. The Bambara later disproved this description when they played a prominent role in the Natchez War in 1729. Many of the Bambara were sold by their Muslim neighbors, the Mandingo. Lesser numbers of Fulbe, Wolof, and Mandingo also came. 17th and 18th century travelers described the Singing Gambia as a region of homogeneous cultures. Most of the various people of the area lived as peaceful neighbors for many centuries. At various times, they belonged to medieval empires of the Ghana, Almoravid, Mali, and Songhai. As such, they enjoyed trade with diverse places such as Spain, Morocco, Florence, Venice, and Timbuktu. One of the centers of trade and learning in the medieval world, far surpassing that of Rome or any other European city. Most societies
wind instruments.
And drums.
And drums. Now, at the same time that Spain took over Louisiana, they threw open the gates to slave importers who brought in lots of Africans. Here's what Gwendolyn Midlow Hall had to say.
As the U.S. War of Independence was coming to a close, Spain opened the slave trade to any friendly power with no customs charged for slaves, and they didn't even keep very careful records because they didn't have any money to collect. So, in the Spanish period, there's a continuous migration from the Bight of Benin, which is where you would get voodoo from. And there's a continuous migration from Greater Senegambia, but there's an increased migration from the Congo, and especially around New Orleans and then St. Charles Parish, it's heavily Congo.
So the Spanish period is when we start to see both military bands and a heavy Congo influence in New Orleans.
That's right. The Congos were, of course, the common factor in the slave trade all across the hemisphere. They were the base layer of Afro-Cuban culture, and they were very important in Haiti. Congo culture is something Haiti, Cuba, and Louisiana have in common. The Haitian Revolution.
It seems that this founding contingent in the colony underwent primary processes of inter-West African transculturation in Louisiana, blending languages and customs, which gradually evolved into a Creole culture and language. When a wave of Congo, Angola people was brought to Louisiana under Spanish rule after the Treaty of Fontainebleau 1762, they adjusted to a certain extent to the Creole culture that had been developed.
So over the years, Congo Square, and this is in 1885, way into the American period, which began in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase. So Congo Square over the years held many, many names. Some were official, but most were not official. Congo Square has never been an official name until 2011, until my first book, Congo Square, African Roots in New Orleans, was released. So in 1893, the square received one official name, which was Beauregard Square. It was named after a Confederate general. And then for 118 years, it held that name until 2011. So although people around the world knew it as Congo Square, I even saw a program that Gabriella just gave to me where there was a conference here entitled Congo Square in 204, I believe it was. So at that point, it was not the official name of the location, but it was a name that people around the world knew. And it was the name that most people in New Orleans knew. When I approached the city council, they didn't even know that it was not officially Congo Square. So here is the archway that leads
Place Congo. Located in an open field behind the French Quarter in downtown New Orleans, Place Congo, also known as Place de Negres, Place Publique, Circus Square, or Beauregard Square, was a gathering spot for the slaves and free African Americans of New Orleans. As many as 600 performers congregated there on Sundays and holidays to dance and sing and play music, often for the benefit of a large audience. Place Congo got its start when Louisiana was still a French colony. It was the custom of French and later Spanish slave owners to give their slaves Sundays off. On those days, slaves were allowed to do largely as they saw fit, and many chose to gather in an open area near the intersection of Rampart and Orleans streets. The tradition was well established by the 1740s, and it continued once Louisiana became a part of the United States in 1803. Masters give their Negroes Saturday and Sunday to themselves, and during that time the master does not give them any food. They then work for other Frenchmen who have no slaves and who pay them, Jean-François Dumont noted in his 1753 memoirs. This practice of the enslaved having free weekends to do as they pleased evolved into the activities of Congo Square that were in full swing by at least the 1740s. In fact, the trading activities of the enslaved had come to form a significant feature of New Orleans' mercantile life, one sufficiently profitable to excite the attention and envy of local retail merchants. One prime example of the Bamboura's cultural retention and adaptability was how they transformed public culture and space in New Orleans. The most significant location was Place des Nègres, also known as La Place Publique and commonly referred to as Congo Square. Taking advantage of Article 5 of the French Code Noir, which exempted enslaved peoples from forced labor on Sundays and religious holidays, Louis XIV's support for creating public culture and performance, and the French administration's laissez-faire attitudes toward public Sunday gatherings of enslaved people, the dominant and entrepreneurial merchant class Bamboura lobbied for and established open-air markets. According to Jared Johnson, participating in the New Orleans market economy enabled them to become a self-supporting group, and selling foodstuff served a real social need in a city suffering from food shortages. The markets began in the 1730s. Question. One of the major points I get from reading Africans in colonial Louisiana was that there was an Afro-Louisianan identity firmly established early on. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall, yes, it was established through language and culture. And the language, of course, was Louisiana Creole, which arose in the first generation. And that's normal. Creole languages do that. They are established very early, and then newcomers have to pretty much learn that language, although, of course, all languages evolve. But Louisiana Creole had been established for a long time before there was any substantial immigration from Haiti. So that Haitian Creole and Louisiana Creole are fairly distinct languages. And you cannot attribute Louisiana Creole to Haitian Creole, which is often done. As to the ethnic composition of the Africans in New Orleans, primary sources are in short supply. But there are some rare statements from the times of Spanish rule. Bishop Cirilo de Barcelona is quoted in C.M. Champion's book In and Around the Old Street, Louis Cathedral of New Orleans, as having issued a pastoral letter in 1786 denouncing Negroes who assembled and danced in a green expanse called Place Congo. They were dancing bambula and performing rites imported from Africa by the Wolofs, Fulas, Bambaras, Mandingos, and other races.
Rhythm that they're playing. The basic rhythms in New Orleans that are the foundation, the fundamental rhythms that we use in everything we do in the culture are three basic rhythms. And one starting with the bambula rhythm, which is basically an African rhythm that you might have heard in Congo Square back in the rhythm that they're playing. The basic rhythms in New Orleans that are the foundation, the fundamental rhythms that we use in everything we do in the culture are three basic rhythms. And one starting with the bambula rhythm, which is basically an African rhythm that you might have heard in Congo Square. Back in the days, they used to play that rhythm. And, with that rhythm comes a bunch of different things, like a dance, and, they're different. And we're gonna just bash out what you might have heard with the bambula rhythm in New Orleans. The bambula rhythm would be just a simple. And you might even hear him say, if you sing the syllable, it sounds just like the rhythm. Bambula, 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 bambula. So you get the idea of that. So basically, that rhythm to me is a Congo Square thing, and it transcends into the second line culture in a major way. But on the other side of that, there's other rhythms like the habanero rhythm. So we all know the habanero rhythm is this basic rhythm here. Now, if you look at the notation, it's basically a dotted 8 with a 16 followed by 2 other 8 notes, which would be. So you get the idea of that. So if you bag it up just a little bit, you could think of the bambula and the tresejo as almost identical, because it's a little bit of a variation of the habanero rhythm, which is. Sounds like the bambula.
The reproachable act of human bondage has stained mankind's history through the ages. While the imprisoned suffered hardships, it's true, Louisiana's history would be incomplete without the Africans' culinary and cultural legacy to this state. Senegambia, the region of West Africa located between the Senegal and Gambia rivers, was home to 2/3 of the slaves brought to Louisiana. During the 1720s, the Company of the Indies focused their efforts on this area where they had exclusive trading rights. Gorée, the best port in the Senegal concession, served as the main warehouse of slaves.
Many of the slaves from Senegal were brought over specifically for their agricultural skills, their skills in cultivating rice, indigo, but also just about every other crop grown in Louisiana, including corn, which they had raised for hundreds of years. But aside from the agricultural skills, they were brought because of mechanical skills. They were not just blacksmiths, but they were machinists.
The first slave ship from Senegal, the Ruby, arrived in Louisiana in July 1720, though a few Africans had lived in the colony since 1709. Between 1720 and 1723, more than 500 slaves came from Senegambia. In 1721, nearly 300 arrived from the Congo and Angola. The last Senegambian slave ship arrived in 1743.
They came from Senegambia, which is the far northwest corner of Africa. I've estimated that about 15% of them were of the Bamana nation. The Wolof were very important people who lived along the coast, and they had a high proportion of women among them, whereas the Bamana were almost entirely men. There was some Fulbe, who also came from Senegal.
In Louisiana, slaves were highly regarded for their cooking abilities. A good cook gardened, pickled, brewed, baked, and even washed, ironed, and sewed. A great variety of tasty delicacies were served daily on the master's table. Being an excellent cook was an asset for an owner, especially if the slave was later sold at auction. Good food was so important to the French settlers that many male slaves were even sent to Paris for culinary training.
Cooking was a very important skill, and cooks and pastry chefs fetched very high prices in Louisiana, in colonial Louisiana.
Occasionally, there was fresh beef or pork. Of course, slaves always received the less desirable cuts of meat. Seasonally, there were turnips, sweet potatoes, or perhaps cabbages, field peas, and rice. Vegetables were cooked in the coals while fresh meat was roasted on a makeshift spit. With only one cooking utensil per household, most slaves either boiled or fried their food.
The slaves largely grew their own food, and they cultivated rice and poultry and pigs and cattle, and they took care of doing their own butchering and salting and preserving. They sold the goods they cultivated in the marketplace, mainly in New Orleans, but in some other more rural areas as well.
Slaves also made pralines, pies, and calais or rice cakes to sell outside of churches, including St. Louis Cathedral after Mass. Many slave men caught and sold oysters on the half-shell to strollers on the levee. The Africans were ingenious cooks. They fed themselves and they fed their master's household. But more importantly, they fed the economy of Louisiana for generations with their free labor and back-breaking work. Today, it's right and just to pay homage to those who contributed so much to the culture and cuisine of this nation.
During the Spanish rule, we find the first court case documenting the persecution of voodoo practices, the famous Gris-Gris case of 1773. By then, black and white Louisianians did no longer consider voodoo charms to be harmless toys, but feared them as life-threatening weapons. 2 enslaved African laborers were accused of attempting to kill their overseer with a poisonous gris-gris. The court recordings demonstrate how naturally everyone involved in this matter used the term gris-gris, including the judge and all the witnesses. Historians Gwendolyn Hall and Marcus Christian concluded, thus independently from one another, that the meaning of this word and the phenomenon it stood for was commonly known at the time. In their view, and I agree with that, this case proves that at least by the 1770s, and thus long before the Haitian refugees arrived, the preparation of voodoo charms was widely practiced in Louisiana. If anything, this incident demonstrates how thoroughly the colony had been Africanized by then. It is also interesting that both of the accused slaves in this case spoke the Mandinga language. One of them understood no other language at all. Mandinga or Molinke and Bambara are very similar languages and are mutually understandable to native speakers. They came from the same area of the larger Senegambian region. Not being capable of speaking or understanding any French or Spanish may not have been a great disadvantage for this young black man. There is some indication that a Bambara dialect, not French or French Creole, was in fact the lingua franca in large parts of the colonial territory until well into the Spanish era. The Spanish rulers of Louisiana also did not introduce any enslaved Africans from the Caribbean to their territory, although motivated by very different concerns. The import of West Indian slaves was strictly prohibited throughout the Spanish period because the Iberian governors were fearful of slave insurrections. The African-based spiritual practices in St. Domingue, Haiti and Louisiana developed thus completely independently from one another during the 18th century. However, since both colonies were founded by the French who reinforced Roman Catholicism, the French language, and French cultural ways, the French ethos among their subjects, including their enslaved workers, people from either place shared a common Francophone heritage. Both colonial societies were also heavily Africanized and shared common West and Central African cultural influences. They have thus often been lumped together as if they were the same. Nevertheless, the African diaspora religions from both regions had distinctly different histories and characteristics.
War, and it was basically over in 1801. At that point, it was officially still a French colony, with Toussaint Louverture in charge. But by then, Napoleon was in power in France, and he decided to turn Haiti back into a wealthy, slave-powered agricultural colony. He thought he'd need Louisiana as a supply base for it, so he pressured Spain to give Louisiana back to France in 1801. But he didn't take possession of it right away. Instead, Napoleon sent his brother-in-law, General Leclerc, across the ocean with tens of thousands of troops in a huge transatlantic invasion to subdue the Haitians and retake Saint-Domingue. General Leclerc's instructions were to proceed on to Louisiana afterward. They thought it would be a cakewalk.
Where have I heard that before?
Planters who had left Saint-Domingue came back when the French troops invaded, thinking they would repossess their plantations and get their slaves back.
Guess what?
The French were driven out of Haiti with tens of thousands dead and never got to Louisiana. By 1803, it had turned into a war of annihilation, which the French lost, and maybe 30,000 refugees fled to eastern Cuba. the slave masters, who were both whites and free people of color, along with their slaves.
There were quite a few slave-owning people of color in Saint-Domingue.
They owned about 30% of the slaves. The arrival of the refugees was a very important moment for Cuba's development.
My name is Andrea Kiala Vene. I am a descendant of slaves from the Kingdom of Dahomey. My ancestors came through Haiti and Santo Domingo. They came to Cuba and had children. This is why we're called Vene d'Angers, because we are descended directly from French stock.
Capitana, pieza lista.
Prender la mecha para una salva mambiza por la puesta del sol. Fuego!
Every night at sunset, the Mambis close the port of Santiago. The Mambis are our ancestors who threw the Spanish into the sea. They danced the tumba when these groups were spreading the ideas of independence. The Spanish were the first to ship Africans to the West Indies. The French planted coffee and sugarcane. They needed a lot of cheap labor to grow the plants. They shipped more slaves than anyone else. They loaded them on the coasts of Guinea, Niger, and the Congo. They even went as far as Mozambique to get them, the other side of Africa. How many of our ancestors were packed into the slave ships? Millions. How many arrived? So many died during the trip. Ill treatment, epidemics, despair. The trip took weeks. I heard so many horrible stories. The slave trade was a great tragedy. When Toussaint Louverture threw the French out of Haiti, the plantation owners left for Cuba. Their house slaves came with them. Their fate was linked to that of their masters. Our ancestors landed here, in the Bay of Santiago. It's a magnificent sight, don't you think?
Cuando ocurre la revolución haitiana, que como todos sabemos es la primera revolución triunfante en el mundo, dirigida y ejecutada por negros, africanos y afrohaitianos. Y ya para los 1800 comienzan las diferentes oleadas, llegadas de emigrantes franceses desde Haití. Estos podían ser blancos, estos podían ser ya mestizos o mulatos. Y llegaron otros franceses directamente de Francia. Estos hombres también vinieron como colonos.
The massive migration of Haitians to New Orleans did not take place until 1809, when large numbers of Haitian refugees, including white Creoles, free Colorids, and their slaves, were expelled from Cuba in reaction to Napoleon's invasion of Spain.
So, Ned, how did the people from Saint-Domingue, or as we call it today, Haiti, wind up in Louisiana?
Most of them came over not from Saint-Domingue, but from Cuba.
And that was in 1809, right?
Exactly, in 1809 and 1810. A number of the Saint-Dominguean refugees who were in eastern Cuba found themselves suddenly persona non grata in Cuba and had to get out, thus going into exile for the second time in 7 years. Our special guest today, Dr. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, explained it like this.
Napoleon invaded Spain and put his brother in as a king of Spain. And there was such a reaction against this in Cuba that they expelled the Haitians. And so these were about 10,000 people. About a third of them were free people of color who owned slaves. Another third were so-called white Creoles of Haiti who also owned slaves, and the other third were the slaves owned by either group. And these people were expelled between 1809 and 1810. They showed up in New Orleans in a whole bunch of shipments, so that there was a sudden introduction of Haitians into New Orleans, and this doubled the free colored population in New Orleans, so that about half the free coloreds were Haitians.
The importation of slaves into the United States was prohibited as of 1808. So in 1809, it was no longer legal for these Dominican slave owners to bring in their slaves to Louisiana. But because they had no other property left, the Dominican slave masters were allowed to keep their slaves by a special act of Congress.
So if these black Dominicans from Cuba were brought in as slaves by a special loophole after the door had slammed shut on slave importation, these people would have been the last slaves imported into the United States legally.
They were.
Orleans in 1809. When Cuba deported many of the French colonials who had settled there 6 years earlier, Louisiana was the preferred destination of those leaving from the ports of Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba. According to a special report made by the mayor of New Orleans, 9,059 Saint Domingue refugees from Cuba arrived between May 1809 and January 1810. Additional arrivals in the first months of 1810 pushed the total to more than 10,000. By comparison, only several hundred refugees arrived in the last decade of Spanish rule and roughly 1,000 at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. All three castes were well represented in the influx of 1,809 to 2,731 whites, 3,102 free persons of color, and 3,226 slaves. In 1809, roughly 10,000 refugees from the former French colony arrived in New Orleans. They had first fled to Cuba, but finding them too troublesome amid the continuing Napoleonic Wars, Spanish colonial officials in 1809 expelled them. That launched a flotilla of boat people mostly from the southeastern ports of Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba, which sat directly across the windward straits from what had become Haiti. Baracoa lay only 150 miles northwest of Cap Haitian, Haiti. Santiago de Cuba lay 250 miles from the Haitian capital of Port-au-Prince. New Orleans lay about 1,100 miles northwest of the two Cuban ports. Reportedly, only one boatload of refugees landed in New Orleans from Havana, 670 miles away. Louisiana History Table. Refugee movement of 1809 compared to the population of Orleans Parish in 1806 and 1810. By racial caste, almost all the refugees expelled from Baracoa and Santiago de Cuba sailed for New Orleans. From May 1809 to January 1810, the mayor counted 9,059 refugees arriving from Cuba. Of this total, 2,731 were white, 3,102 were free persons of color, and 3,226 were slaves. The last represented almost a third of the 1810 census. Origins of Louisiana's antebellum plantation economy. In 1795, on a French Creole plantation outside of New Orleans, Etienne de Bourier's enslaved workforce, laboring under the guidance of a skilled free black chemist named Antoine Morin, produced Louisiana's first commercially successful crop of granulated sugar, demonstrating that sugar cane could be profitably grown in Louisiana. At roughly the same moment, American inventors were perfecting new mechanized cotton gins, the most famous of which was patented by Eli Whitney in 1794. These machines, which removed cotton seeds from cotton fibers far faster than could be done by hand, dramatically increased the profitability of cotton farming, enabling large-scale cotton production in the Mississippi River Valley. The simultaneous introduction of these two cash crops, sugarcane and cotton, represented an economic revolution for Louisiana. Prospective planters flooded into the territory, carving its rich, river-fed soils into sugar and cotton plantations. Yet in 1803, Congress outlawed the international importation of enslaved people into the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase territory. While 4 years later, in 1808, Congress outlawed the transatlantic slave trade entirely. To provide labor for this emerging economic machine, slave traders began purchasing enslaved people from the Upper South, where demand for enslaved people was falling, and reselling them in the Lower South, where demand was soaring. By 1860, more than 124,000 enslaved Africans and African Americans had been carried to Louisiana by this domestic slave trade, destroying countless families while transforming New Orleans into the nation's largest slave market. Louisiana's enslaved population exploded, from fewer than 20,000 enslaved individuals in 1795 to more than 168,000 in 1840 and more than 331,000 in 1860. Between 1820 and 1830, they doubled in number from 7,355 to 14,440, mostly because of domestic imports at the end of the decade. In a letter written in March 1830, a Saint-Domingue refugee living in New Orleans reported that so many American slaves were being imported that they will soon be more numerous than Creoles and foreign slaves both in the country and in the city. Only house servants of American birth are to be seen in every home. In January 1831, he wrote that over the 2 preceding years more than 20,000 slaves had been introduced into the state, and complained that everywhere one only hears English spoken, for in every house there are a number of old servants who have become fluent in this idiom. One can imagine the inconvenience to unilingual French-speaking masters of household slaves conversing in a language they did not understand. By providing such masters with an incentive to learn English, slaves may well have contributed to their Americanization.
Nearly 500,000 Africans survived the Middle Passage, eventually arriving in the United States. But a second Middle Passage, inside our country, was over twice as large in scale. The domestic slave trade fueled the nation's booming cotton economy, and in the process, shattered black families.
After Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, cotton exploded as a cash crop.
You have this technological innovation. The cotton gin makes it quicker, easier to separate the seed from the cotton boll itself. And you also have the Louisiana Purchase and the seizing of indigenous Native American land. As a result of that, you have this new land in the West. You have a demand for cotton and a demand for labor.
Slave owners from states in the Upper South sold their slaves to traders, who then transported them to the cotton-producing states in the Deeper South and further to the West. This came to be known as the Second Middle Passage, and its effects on the African American community would be devastating.
They were forcibly sold, separated from families, husbands from wives, parents from children, siblings from one another, forced to make these trips chained and bound together and clearing the way for settlement of white Americans.
About 1 million slaves moved between these older states and the newer states in the South over the course of 3 decades in the 19th century. So there's this massive slave trade domestically that attends the opening up of the cotton territories and the rise of the cotton kingdom in the South.
Countless families became the victims of the largest forced migration in our country's history. But there were huge profits to be made off of black bodies. Once they arrived at their destination, families that had made the journey together often were ripped apart.
As the slave trade did in Africa, the domestic slave trade scrambles any kind of community that black people had come to know, and it leads to this new round of massive alienation and forces them to start all over again.
This horrendous dislocation lasted until the Civil War began. But the consequences of the Second Middle Passage devastated generations of black families.
The dispute is seen as part of a wider denial of the influence of the enslaved Africans in African food on American food culture. There are 2 counter-narratives regarding the origins of gumbo. First is the argument that gumbo evolved from a French dish called bouillabaisse, which is a fish-based stew. This appears to be a wholly Eurocentric myth. In an essay titled The Origin Myth of New Orleans Cuisine, food historian Lawless Eric Ellie wrote, "As for the relationship between gumbo and bouillabaisse, I can find very little." I also spoke with Dr. Shane Bernard, a Louisiana author and historian, about gumbo. Bernard pointed to the earliest written reference to gumbo from a court document that details part of the interrogation of an enslaved person about allegations of theft. In the transcript, the interrogator references "un gumbo." Dr. Bernard noted, "The significance of this passage is that it pushes back the earliest known reference to gumbo to 1764, indicating that the dish was known in Louisiana even before the arrival of the Acadian exiles, whose Cajun descendants, unjustly or not, are the ethnic group most often associated with gumbo by the general public."
In West Africa, okra was a popular vegetable prized for its thickening ability. Gumbo, the African word for okra, became the name of Louisiana's most famous soup, which is generally made with okra and seafood or poultry.
The first reference I found to gumbo was 1764, and this was in testimony by runaway slaves living in New Orleans and very close by. And they had feasts in the French Quarter in which they sent out to the market to buy food for creating gumbo, and they explained that they all bought filet as well as seafood.
Black-eyed peas, a popular southern dish, is always served on New Year's Day in Louisiana for health in the new year. One of the most famous dishes in southern cooking, hoppin' john, is a combination of black-eyed peas and rice.
When I was in Senegal, I visited the region near the mouth of the Senegal River, and you would think that you were in the Louisiana wetlands. There are pelicans, there are the same crustaceans, there are fish, and then of course there was rice.
Rice is a staple of the African diet. It's used for breakfast to make rice water, a porridge-like dish similar to Louisiana's rice pudding. As in Africa, rice is served here with stews and soup, and rice flour is used as a thickening agent. Moi moi, or couscous, a favorite African dish, is served in Louisiana as red beans and rice.
The main dish of the day is a dish that has much rice. But in the evening, you might have a little couscous, or you might just have the meat with bread and salad.
Black pepper, which originated in Sumatra, was used as money. Even taxes and dowries were paid with pepper.
You don't get Senegalese food without parsley, garlic, and hot pepper.
In West Africa, chicken was a dish for festive occasions and honored guests, most commonly served stewed over boiled yams or rice. In Louisiana, popular Sunday meals still consist of fried, stewed, or smothered chicken.
Part of the reason that Senegalese cooks are so extraordinary is that I think they love cooking. I think people love cooking. They love good food, and they love plenty, and they love visitors.
The flavors of Africa incorporated so nicely into the Louisiana diet that I'm surprised we haven't yet adopted their famous greeting. When an African returned from travel, they were not asked, "Did you have a good time?" but, "Have you eaten well?" Whether in Africa or Louisiana, you can bet they did.
Today, Voodoo is divided into several distinct sects, including New Orleans Voodoo, which combines elements of Catholicism with traditional African practices. Introduced to the United States by African slaves in 1719, Voodoo made its way into Louisiana by way of Haiti during the Haitian Revolution.
Anthropology at the University of New Orleans. She wrote a book on the queen priestess of them all in New Orleans, who was actually two women with the same name, a mother and daughter, each known as Marie Lavo.
They were good Catholics. They were married and buried within the Catholic traditions.
And there are other similarities, she says.
Catholics have a lot of...
The massive migration of Haitians to New Orleans did not take place until 1809, when large numbers of Haitian refugees, including white Creoles, free Colorids, and their slaves, were expelled from Cuba in reaction to Napoleon's invasion of Spain. 73. The term Grigri appears in New Orleans court records as early as 1773. Zinzin, meaning amulet of support or power in Louisiana Creole, is a Bambara word with the same meaning. Question. There's a certain amount of lore that suggests that from that point we start to see, though there was already, as you pointed out, a Dahomean population in Louisiana. At that point, we start to see voodoo appear in New Orleans culture. And I noticed that in Louisiana they have voodoo queens, something unknown in Haiti. Gwendolyn Midlo Hall. Exactly. It's distinctive. And Marie Lavo, there's this tendency to have everybody be Haitian. And they weren't, including Marie Lavo. She had no Haitian ancestors. She was Louisiana Creole. Charles Lalonde, who was the leader of the 1811 slave revolt on the German coast, Charles Gayere passed the misinformation that he was a free man of color from Haiti. He was no such thing. He was a mulatto Creole slave of Louisiana. And I have not found any Haitians involved in any revolt or conspiracy against slavery in Louisiana. And I've looked through lots and lots of documents, and you can look yourself in my database. None of them were Haitians. Haitian Voodoo is an African diasporic religion that came together from the traditional African religious practices of several tribes, some of whom were rivals forced to survive and depend on one another under the conditions of slavery. These tribes included the Fon, Yoruba, Congo, and even elements of the native Taíno population that survived in Haiti. These people united their practices in an effort to survive and created a regelman, ritual order, to honor and give each tribe's spirits their moment of worship. These practices were also influenced through syncretism with French Catholicism. Evidence of this can be seen in the use of Catholic saint images to represent the Elwa, spirits honored in Voodoo. The Elwa, spirits of Voodoo, are composed of the Rada Elwa, the Voodoo and Orishas of the Fon and Yoruba people, the Petu Elwa, the fiery spirits of the Congo, the Taíno and modern Haitian people, and the Guide Elwa, the spirits of the dead. Thieves, ornate cornmeal drawings laid out on the ground or on tables, are used to call the Elwa in Voodoo, but not in Santeria. Haitian Voodoo does have an initiated priesthood, but initiation is not a requirement for participation in the religion, and the vast majority of Vodouisans are non-initiates. Magical Wanga and Grigri are often used in Haitian Voodoo's magic. Haitian Voodoo's primary liturgical language is Creole, the local dialect of Haitian French. Louisiana Vodou is markedly different from Haitian Voodoo. It is more of an amalgamation of religious and magical practices found in the southern United States. This includes some of the Elwa found in Haitian Voodoo, a strong presence of the Catholic saints, and elements of southern folk magic like Grigri, Wanga, and Mojo bags. There is not a regelman in the same manner as Haitian Voodoo, and there is more of an emphasis on self-made voodoo queens like the famous Marie Lavo. Louisiana Vodou has a strong connection with spiritualism and shares many magical techniques with hoodoo, southern folk magic, but should not be confused with hoodoo. You will see the use of vives, ornate painted symbols, in Louisiana Vodou, much as in Haitian Voodoo. Louisiana Vodou's primary liturgical language is English with a bit of French Creole.
This episode of The Tea, we are digging into the woman, the myth, the legend, Marie Lavo, the queen of New Orleans voodoo. Many of Marie Lavo's biographical details are disputed, but we stand because she is in no question a total queen. Okay, y'all, let's jump in. This is The Tea. Number 5, who is Marie Lavo? While the exact historical records of Marie Lavo's life remain ambiguous, her story is renowned. Her legacy illuminates issues on race, gender, and class intertwined with the occult and folklore. Marie was born a free person of color and is said to have been baptized in St. Louis Cathedral in the French Quarter. Marie Lavo has been described as many things: a devout Catholic who was known for her acts of charity, a community leader who defied pro-slavery laws, a working hairdresser who became the town confidant, and most famously, the Queen of Voodoo. According to church documents, Marie died of natural causes around 1881 and is buried in St. Louis Cemetery in New Orleans. You're telling me that Marie was a voodoo priestess, an activist, a nurse, had 7 to 15 children, and still made it to Mass every Sunday? I will have what she is having. Number 4. So, what is voodoo? Voodoo came to Louisiana with enslaved West Africans when they merged their rituals and practices with Catholicism. The voodoo of TV shows, movies, and fiction is often portrayed as evil magic involving zombies, voodoo dolls, and animal sacrifices. In reality, it's a religion connected to nature, spirits, and ancestors. The core belief of New Orleans voodoo is that spirits can interfere in lives, and those who practice voodoo believe they can connect with these spirits through rituals of dance, music, chanting, and even snakes. This sacred and rich religion is still practiced today. I am a big history nerd, and I can 100% report that this was not taught to me in school. Number 3, how did Marie Lavo become Queen of Voodoo? Stories say that because Marie built up such a trusted reputation in town while she was a hairdresser, she began to offer voodoo rituals, grigri, and spells to her clients as a new service. Marie Lavo held large public voodoo ceremonies in town on Congo Square and at her summer home on Lake Pontchartrain. Everyone wanted her help and influence. There are rumors of secret ceremonies in the swamp where Lavo would perform magic and spirit possession. But of course, there are no historical records to back up these claims. She is credited as a powerful spiritual leader who created places of worship for enslaved and free African people.
Nevertheless, inspecting the original, I went straight to, and could clearly make out, the reference I wanted in Governor Esteban Miro's Bando de Buen Gobierno, Edict of Good Government, of June 2, 1786, a set of 34 orders for the colony. Apparently responding to Cirillo's complaint about the bambula being danced on the Sabbath, Governor Miro ordered that Los Tangos, o Bailes de Negros, the tangos, that is, the blacks' dances, be delayed until after Vespers, Los Tangos, o Bailes de Negros. This is apparently the earliest written instance of the word tango anywhere. The word was surely being used in Cuba at that time, and probably long before that, but I know of no Cuban document in which it appears that early. For one thing, there was no popular press there yet. Robert Ferris Thompson, who wrote a book on the African roots of tango without uncovering an earlier written instance of the word, traces tango to the Kikongo. It's more than a word. It's a semantic spectrum. It's a semantic range. And on both sides of the Atlantic, it means a dance, a place of dance, the people who dance it, the beat of the dance, and many other things. So, the word tango to describe black dancing in New Orleans. In 1786, a full century before the emergence in Argentina of the dance by that name. But not only that, it's being equated with dancing the bambula. Cirillo complained about the bambula, so to please him, Governor Miro required the postponement of the tangos.
The bambula dance. This is one of the earliest references to the bambula dance. It was 1786, and one of the bishops complained about people dancing the bambula before the end of services. Remember I said on Sundays, enslaved people were able to enjoy the Sundays as holy days, but in the afternoons they could come and dance. Well, in this case, they were dancing before the afternoons, before they were were allowed to do so. And he responds by using the word tangos, which is one of the earliest references to the word tangos. And important when you think about tangos and habanera and the bambula dance, the Congo dance, all those are connected. I want to move as quickly as I can to